With Beelzebub bound, Solomon didn't kill him, didn't banish him, didn't even punish him in any way that vengeance might have demanded. Instead, he did something far stranger and far more practical. He put him to work. The text describes it almost casually, as though this were the most obvious use imaginable for a captured demon prince. Solomon commanded Beelzebub to summon the rest of his kind, not to torment or destroy them, but to labor, to quarry stone, to carry beams, to do, essentially, the exhausting physical work of building God's temple. The very structure whose construction had started this entire chain of events with one suffering boy. One by one, they came, compelled by the ring's authority passing through Beelzebub. Demon after demon arrived at the construction site, and one by one, Solomon bound each of them the same way, questioning each briefly before setting them to labor alongside the human workers. Most of them, the text treats almost like a catalog, spirits of minor afflictions, put to minor tasks, unremarkable in the grand scope of the story. But one demon's arrival stopped Solomon cold. His name was Asmodeus, and unlike the others, he didn't simply appear and submit. He resisted, argued, and when questioned, answered with something closer to open contempt than fear. Asmodeus identified himself as the spirit responsible for something far more intimate than plague or grief. He was the demon of desire, twisted into destruction, the force behind marriages poisoned from within, husbands and wives driven apart not by outside tragedy, but by their own worst impulses toward each other. Solomon asked him, directly, what his purpose was among mortals. Asmodeus's answer unsettled even the king. He said he delighted in turning virgins away from their intended husbands, in planting suspicion between spouses who had once loved each other completely, in taking the most sacred bond humans were capable of forming and slowly, patiently, rotting it from the inside. There was something almost personal in the way Asmodeus spoke, not the detached cruelty Orneus had described, but something closer to resentment. When Solomon pressed him on why, Asmodeus gave an answer that the text records without further explanation, as though even Solomon's scribes weren't entirely sure what to make of it. He claimed that no love between two mortals could ever be trusted to last, and that he simply hastened what was, in his view, always inevitable anyway. Solomon bound him like the others, but he kept Asmodeus close during the construction, not trusting him for a moment, watching him more carefully than any other captured spirit, as though some instinct told him this one, more than the rest, was worth understanding rather than simply commanding. Month after month, the impossible labor force worked. Demons carried stones no team of men could lift. Demons dug foundations in a fraction of the time ordinary construction demanded. The temple that would define an entire nation's relationship with God rose, stone by stone, built in part by the very forces of darkness Solomon had sworn to stand against. It was, by every account, Solomon's greatest triumph. It was also, though he didn't yet realize it, the exact moment his story began quietly turning toward its end. The vision Enoch describes next doesn't take place on earth at all. It happens, if the text is to be believed, before earth existed in any form recognizable to us. Enoch says he was shown the dwelling place of the righteous and the resting places of the holy, and standing among them, in a position no other figure in the vision occupied, was someone the text calls simply the Son of Man. He wasn't newly created for this scene. He wasn't born into it. The text is careful, almost insistent, about this detail. This figure existed already, named already, chosen already, in the presence of the Lord of Spirits, before the sun and the stars were made, before the constellations of heaven were fixed in place. Enoch asks the angel walking beside him a question any reader would ask in his position. Who is this? Why does he stand there, beside the very source of time itself, when nothing else in creation had yet been given form? And the answer he receives is the part of this text that later readers would find impossible to read without thinking of someone else entirely. This is the Son of Man, the angel tells him, who has righteousness, with whom righteousness dwells, who reveals all the treasures of what is hidden. He was chosen and hidden in God's presence before the world was created, and he will remain hidden until the appointed time, kept in reserve, the text implies, for a purpose not yet due, hidden, chosen before the world existed, a righteousness that dwells within him rather than something he simply performs. To a reader encountering this text for the first time, centuries before any gospel was written, these words describe something entirely new, a figure who is neither fully God nor simply another prophet, but something positioned deliberately between the two, waiting. Enoch doesn't ask what this figure will eventually do. Not yet. That answer comes later, in visions still ahead of him. For now, he is simply shown that this being exists, that he has always existed in some sense, and that his concealment itself is part of a plan too vast for Enoch, standing there in awe, to fully comprehend. The angel offers him one more detail before moving on, something that will matter enormously in the visions still to come. This hidden figure, the angel says, will one day be revealed. Not quietly, not to a chosen few. He will be revealed to the entire world at the exact moment the world least expects to see him. Enoch's vision doesn't end with simply learning that this hidden figure exists. The angel shows him what this figure is for, and it is here that the text stops sounding like a quiet mystical riddle and starts sounding like a warning aimed directly at the powerful. The Son of Man, Enoch is told, will one day rise from his hidden throne, and when he does, his first act will not be mercy toward the meek, though mercy is promised to them too. His first act will be judgment, specifically, judgment against kings and the mighty of the earth. The text names them without softening the accusation. Those who possess the earth, it says, and do not glorify the name of the Lord of spirits. Rulers who sit comfortably on thrones built from the suffering of those beneath them. The wealthy, whose riches came from hands other than their own labor. Enoch is shown their reaction to this coming judgment, and it is not what a reader might expect from men who have spent their lives being obeyed without question. When the Son of Man is finally revealed, the text says, the kings and the mighty will not stand proudly before him. They will fall on their faces. They will plead for a moment's mercy, a brief delay before judgment falls, and they will not receive it. There is a particular kind of fear the text describes here. Not fear of a sudden violent death, which every ancient ruler understood and had made some peace with, but fear of being finally, permanently seen for exactly what they were. The Son of Man's judgment in this vision isn't described as punishment inflicted from outside. It's described almost as an unveiling, as if the hidden judge's mere presence exposes every hidden cruelty a throne had managed to disguise as order for years, sometimes generations. Enoch asks the angel a question that feels, even now, remarkably direct for a vision this ancient. Why do the mighty deserve no mercy at all, when Enoch himself has been shown so much mercy simply by being permitted to witness these things? The answer he receives doesn't soften the judgment. It sharpens it. Mercy, the angel tells him, was always available to them. Every day they ruled, every choice they made about how to treat the people beneath them. What is coming is not the withdrawal of a mercy they never had access to. It is simply the end of the delay they mistook for permission. Up to this point, Enoch's visions have shown him a hidden judge, waiting somewhere beyond time itself. But the angel guiding him makes something clear that reframes everything Enoch has seen so far. This judgment isn't happening in isolation. It has a cause, and that cause reaches all the way back to a story Enoch already knows, one he lived through himself. Genesis mentions it in 6 brief words, almost in passing. The sons of God saw the daughters of men and took them as wives. The Book of Enoch refuses to let that sentence stay brief. It names the angels involved, watchers, the text calls them, 200 of them, bound together by an oath sworn on a mountain, agreeing collectively to abandon heaven and descend to earth. What they wanted, the text says plainly, was exactly what any reader of Genesis would suspect. Human wives, human pleasures, a taste of the physical world they'd only ever observed from a distance. But what they produced was something far more dangerous than the text's earlier chapters had prepared anyone for. Their offspring were giants, Nephilim, the text calls them. And they did not simply grow tall, they grew hungry, in a way nothing born naturally into the world ever had been. The text describes them consuming everything humanity could produce, and when that wasn't enough, turning on humanity itself, and eventually on each other. The earth, Enoch is shown, began to cry out, not metaphorically, but as a living witness bearing testimony against the violence being done to it. And it was this cry, the angel tells him, that reached the Lord of Spirits and set in motion everything Enoch has already been shown. The flood that would follow, and the judgment still waiting, hidden for the age still to come. Here is where the vision connects itself directly to the hidden Son of Man Enoch has already seen. The angels who fell, Enoch is told, will not simply be punished alongside humanity in the flood and then forgotten. They are bound now in darkness, awaiting a second judgment, a final one, reserved specifically for the day the hidden judge finally rises from his throne. Noah survives the flood that follows. Humanity, in some diminished form, continues, but the watchers themselves remain bound, the text insists, precisely because their crime was never simply about lust or rebellion in isolation. It was the first time a created being looked at the natural order itself and decided it did not apply to them. And that, the angel tells Enoch, is exactly what the Son of Man's judgment exists to finally answer, not just for angels who broke an ancient oath, but for every king and ruler since, who looked at the order meant to govern them and quietly decided the same thing. Enoch's vision now moves past waiting, past explanation, and into the moment itself, the day the hidden judge finally rises. The text describes it without any comfort for the powerful, the kings and the mighty of the earth, the very rulers who once fell to their faces in dread at the mere sight of him, are now brought forward for a reckoning that has no appeal, no negotiation, no delay left to beg for. Their thrones, the same thrones built from stolen labor, from bodies worked past breaking, from silence bought with fear, mean nothing here. The Son of Man does not simply defeat them. He unmakes the illusion they spent their entire lives maintaining. That power, once seized, becomes permanent. That cruelty, dressed convincingly enough in royal robes, becomes indistinguishable from order. Enoch watches as their faces, once terrifying to look upon, become the faces of men, finally, fully seen. Every quiet cruelty they disguised as necessary governance, every suffering they dismissed as the unavoidable cost of maintaining their thrones, none of it remains hidden anymore. The text is careful, though, not to describe this only as destruction. It is a separation. The righteous, those who were crushed beneath these very kings, those whose suffering built empires they never benefited from, are shown something entirely different. Vindication, a dwelling place prepared for them beside the very throne their oppressors once sat, comfortably distant from. Enoch asks his final question of this vision. What happens to the earth itself, now that both judgments, the ancient flood behind him and this final reckoning ahead of him, have been carried out? The angel's answer is the one thing in this entire text that reads less like ancient apocalyptic warning and more like a promise meant to outlast every empire that would ever try to silence it. The world does not simply end in this judgment. It is renewed, made new specifically for those who were told, generation after generation, that their suffering was permanent, and their oppressor's power was too. The Son of Man returns to his throne, not hidden any longer, seen, finally, by the entire world he'd been kept from until exactly this moment. For nearly 2,000 years, scholars, priests, and skeptics alike have argued over exactly what Enoch saw in that vision. And the argument itself reveals almost as much as the text does. The most obvious reading, the one that unsettled early Christian authorities enough to eventually exclude this book entirely, is difficult to avoid once you've read the passage carefully. A pre-existent figure hidden before creation, named the Son of Man, destined to judge kings and vindicate the righteous. To a reader steeped in the Gospels, these phrases sound less like coincidence and more like blueprint, as though whoever wrote the Gospel of Matthew had this exact text open on the table beside them. Some scholars take this seriously enough to argue that the Book of Enoch didn't simply anticipate Christian theology by accident. They suggest it may have directly shaped it, that the earliest followers of Jesus, steeped in a Jewish apocalyptic tradition that took Enoch's authority seriously, reached for this exact language because it was already sitting there, waiting, ready-made for exactly the claim they needed to make about who Jesus was. Other scholars push back hard against this reading, and their objection isn't a small one. The section of Enoch containing this vision, the Book of Parables, has never once been found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, despite fragments of nearly every other section of Enoch turning up there in abundance. Its absence raises an uncomfortable possibility that this specific vision may have been written later than the rest of the book, possibly even after Jesus himself, by a Jewish author who had already encountered early Christian claims and was responding to them, rather than predicting them. If that's true, the entire relationship reverses. The Son of Man wouldn't be prophecy fulfilled by Christ. It would be a Jewish text borrowing Christian language and quietly writing it back into an older, more authoritative-sounding source. Enoch's own text refuses to settle this argument for us. And that refusal is, in its own way, the most honest thing about it. Whoever this hidden judge was meant to represent, a genuine glimpse of something still to come, or a later reflection shaped by events the original author never witnessed. The text itself insists on one thing above all, that this figure's true identity was never meant to be understood too early. Hidden until the appointed time, the angel told Enoch. Perhaps that instruction was never only about Enoch's own vision. Perhaps it was aimed at every reader who would ever try, centuries later, to finally pin the answer down. There is one final twist in this text, and it is the twist that made even ancient readers uncomfortable enough to argue about it for centuries afterward. Near the very end of the Book of Parables, Enoch is taken up bodily one last time, not for another vision of things to come, but for something that reads on the surface like a homecoming. Angels surround him. He is shown once more the throne, the hidden judge, the entire architecture of judgment he has now witnessed across multiple visions. And then the text does something almost no reader expects, even after everything that came before it. The voice speaking to Enoch turns and says, "You are the Son of Man, who is born unto righteousness." Not a messenger describing a separate, hidden figure any longer. A direct declaration, spoken to Enoch himself, that he, this same man who walked with God centuries before the flood, this same man Genesis dismissed in 5 brief verses, was, somehow, the very figure whose judgment he had been shown, again and again, from a careful, humble distance. Scholars have argued for centuries about what this actually means. Some read it as a formal enthronement, Enoch elevated, transformed, absorbed into the role he had only ever observed from outside. Others argue the text is deliberately ambiguous, using a title so flexible in ancient apocalyptic writing that it could apply to multiple figures without fully collapsing them into one. But sit with the plain reading for a moment, the way an ancient reader would have first encountered it, without centuries of theological caution built up around it. A man who did not die, taken instead into the presence of God, now told explicitly that he himself carries the title of the very judge who will one day rise, unveil every hidden cruelty, and remake the world. It's easy to see why the councils who decided what would become scripture centuries later might have looked at a passage like this and hesitated, not because it was clearly false, because it was dangerously unclear what it might mean if it were true. And unclear claims about who exactly stands beside the throne of judgment were never something institutions built on careful hierarchy could afford to leave unresolved. So the book was set aside instead, not refuted, not disproven, simply removed from the conversation entirely, left for the Ethiopian church alone to preserve in full, while the rest of the world inherited only the 6 verses Genesis originally gave us, a man who walked with God and then was not, for God took him. We will likely never know exactly what the author intended by that final declaration, but it remains there, in a book almost no one reads anymore, quietly waiting, the same way its hidden judge once waited, unseen, for exactly the moment someone would finally be ready to ask what it really meant.